You're listening to Were You Still Talking? Hello and welcome to another episode of Were You Still Talking? This is Joel Albrecht once again, and with me today I have Robert Ginsberg, the founder of Forever Family Foundation, author of Medium Explosion, and currently featured in the Netflix Docuseries Surviving Death. He has been investigating mediumship and other evidence of life after death since 2003 and conducts a certification process by which mediums are evaluated to see if they can do what they claim. He's also the host of Signs of Life radio show and a past editor of Signs of Life magazine. He also has a book out that we'll talk about. So we're going to talk about evidence for life after death, which is very intriguing to me. Grief, mediums, near-death experiences. All the interesting stuff about what happens after we pass on. Robert, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Really nice to have you.
It's my pleasure to be with you, Joel.
The big question, well, there's a lot of big questions when you dive into this stuff, but the first thing that makes me curious is how this started. How did you start this becoming? How did you get interested in investigating mediums?
Yeah, well, if we were having this conversation 20 years ago, we wouldn't be having this conversation 20 years ago, because I thought the notion of life after death and us surviving, physical death was preposterous. It was wishful thinking for those who fear death and they feel comfort in believing that there's some place that we go. Then, 20 years ago, I won't get into all the details and bore you to tears, but my son and my daughter were involved in a car accident. My daughter didn't survive her injuries, and my son had very serious injuries, and he subsequently, did survive. But there were several things that happened. One happened the morning that my son and my daughter were involved in the car accident at 3:30 in the morning. My wife shot up in bed and was literally shaking, and she was ashen white and trembling. I said, "What's the matter?" And she said, "Something horrible is going to happen today." And I said, What does that mean?" She said, "I can't tell you exactly, but our lives are going to be devastated today." And so I took it seriously, even though I didn't really believe in premonitions or anything like that, because there were many times in our lives together where she had similar things, and they all played out exactly the way she said they were going to play out. They were all good things, but then logically, logic told me that if she was right then, she could be right now. And I watched over my 3 kids during the day, as most parents would do, with that kind of a dire warning. And I blame myself because I let my guard down at night, and that's when the accident happened. But I was in shock for about a month while, my son was recovering from his injuries. And then I remembered one day that, wait a second, I remembered that morning. I said, well, how did my wife, know? I mean, she knew. She was shaking. And that started me. I became obsessed with finding out how she knew. And not only that, I started traveling across the United States, meeting with medical doctors and scientists and researchers that studied consciousness. So I wanted to know if there was any real credible evidence, not any woo-woo stuff, that told me that she could still possibly survive. And that's how this, the story began. One thing led to another, and I learned as much as I could. I read voraciously. I read hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books, and things you mentioned. Some of them, I learned about near-death experiences and consciousness and telepathy and remote viewing, ESP, and deathbed visions and reincarnation and electronic voice phenomena and so forth. So the more I read and the more I interviewed people, I couldn't believe that there was just so much evidence that was relatively unknown to the mainstream. And that, got me to work even harder. Eventually, we formed this not-for-profit organization in 2004 called, Forever Family Foundation. And our mission is really just to educate the public about established evidence that we're more than our physical bodies, and that evidence can come from, many different sources. So my life is a hell of a lot different now than it was 20 years ago.
Yes, I can imagine.
Yeah.
It's always it's interesting to me because most of the stuff I want to believe in all of this, and I've seen I've just talked to too many people, seen too many people who seem very credible talk about life after death, and that there's more to this. At the same time, I've had a very good magician on my show that said he could convince anyone that he's a medium and that he could read minds, because he there's a way to do it as a magic trick, which is interesting. So I'm kind of excited to talk to you, who's looking into it, who is very analytical and is, looking into it in a factual way, and being driven to it, but being driven to it like a lot of people are, through a tragedy and through someone they know passing away. I mean, all the near-death experience stuff I've heard, it's the person. And I've also heard I've heard from a lot of medical people who are pretty convinced that there's, that something happens beyond, just the brain activity stopping and stuff like that. I don't even know if there's a question there. I'm glad to have you looking into it.
Yeah, I mean, you touched on a few things there. I mean, the thing that's the most compelling to me about near-death experiences is that people meet every definition that medical science has for death. I mean, they have no respiration, they have no brain waves, they have no heartbeat, they have no reflexes. Medical science tells us that they're dead. And yet, people with all the resuscitative techniques that we have now very often are brought back to life. And at a time when they had none of those things, they had, no brain waves and so forth, they report these clear and lucid experiences, including being above their body and being at a different location. Not everybody has the same experience. I mean, there are about 10 different common experiences that people report, but not one experience that, has them all. But very compelling is sometimes people report back things that they couldn't possibly have known, like conversations that were had in the operating arena, descriptions of the equipment that was being used. There are cases Dr. Kenneth Ring wrote about where there were people that have been blind since birth, they've been sightless, and yet they have this experience where they're outside of their body, and they report back all the colors and everything that was going on in vibrant detail. So, that's very compelling to me. A lot of the arguments used probably by some people that you talk to, oxygen deprivation, it's just a product of a dying brain, it's hallucinations. But, the lack of oxygen, like fighter pilots and so forth, hypoxia, when that happens, it's anything but clear and lucid thinking. It's disjointed. You're fragments. You're all over the place. You're thrashing about. It's the opposite of what you would expect, from a brain that was dying. So to me, it's a very important form of evidence, that the mind, when I say mind, you could use the term consciousness or even soul, can act independently of the physical brain. Once you believe that, then all this other stuff that we're talking about becomes plausible, if not probable. You mentioned mediumship before. So in 2005, with the help of some scientists, I developed a medium evaluation certification process. So we wanted to try to identify mediums that really could do what they claim. And there are a lot of frauds out there, and there are a lot of people that are not necessarily fraudulent, but they have some form of intuitive ability, which I think we all do in various degrees, but yet they can't, communicate with a discarnate source. And what I found in my own work, and after talking and witnessing, hundreds upon hundreds of medium readings over the years, is that roughly 85 to 90% of all the mediums that are practicing today cannot do what they claim. Only 10 to 15% can. And what you mentioned before, like you had on a magician, and he's talking about cold reading techniques. And I could do the same thing and make generalizations. I could notice the dilation in your pupils and little head movements and body language, and I can make certain assumptions. And I could give you correct information. So, Joel, if you're the medium and you're giving a reading to me and you're looking at me and you say, Bob, I have your great grandmother here in spirit. Do you have a great grandmother who's passed? Like, shit, yeah, it should be 130.
That's a pretty easy one.
So that's, it's not very evidential.
Right.
On the other hand, if you said to me, I have your grandmother Rebecca here, and her name was Rebecca, I'd give that more weight than somebody just making a general statement. And there is a difference between, because you also mentioned, reading minds, so there are some people that are very gifted psychically, and, they could read minds, other living minds, but they have no ability to communicate with the scarnate entity, somebody that's no longer in the physical world. So there's a distinction between the two. And it's very hard for us when we're evaluating the evidence, because we have to separate psychic information from mediumistic information,
And how in the world do you evaluate the evidence? I mean, I'm not a scientist or a doctor, but I read a lot of stuff. And from what there's two things that I kind of understand. We know very little about consciousness. Like, there's still no real evidence of how consciousness even exists, and why, whether or not it exists in other species and things. But how do you go about, like, what kind of evidentiary science is being used?
Well, first of all, we don't conduct it as a scientific experiment, because we're not scientists, but we do set up controls. So the whole process takes place under controlled conditions. And what we do is we train sitters in mediumship and how to score a reading and what's evidence, what's general, information, and they have some extensive training. And then a medium, when they finally make it to the point of going through interviews and applications and so forth, when we evaluate them, they are required to do 5 readings for 5 different trained sitters. And the scoring is based on composite scoring, and there's 5 different scoring methods that we use. And as I alluded to before, significant evidence is weighted more heavily than general evidence. So using another example, I would have to mark that as a hit if you said that my great grandmother passed, because it's true, but it's hardly evidential. But if you gave me an exact name or other very specific information, we would weight that more heavily. And so, if a medium, which is only about 10% of the time, meets all of our minimum guidelines, then we grant them, certification and so forth. Instantly, no money ever changes hands. We don't charge for the process. Or we don't want to mess with the integrity, of the program. And even after they're certified, we just list their name as a resource for the bereaved. The problem for us, since we've been doing it for so long, is that many of the mediums that we've certified over the years have gone on to become famous. And when, TV shows, big books, and what happens when somebody becomes famous, they, first of all, they have waiting lists, of 2-3 years, and if you're somebody that's grieving and you want a medium reading and you call them and they say, I can read you in 3 years, that doesn't do much good. Plus they're charging ridiculous amounts of money and so forth. So we have to, keep identifying more mediums that are accessible, that are qualified. So it's not it's a hard thing to do, but we keep working at it.
So and people that come to you and they're looking for a medium, is it usually people who have had a tragedy recently, or does it kind of, is there all kinds of different situations that people come for? And part two of the question is, what kind of stuff, what are they looking for? Because I've kind of been so about the idea of actually speaking to someone who's passed. For one, I don't want to bother them. It's like, they're done. They did their time here. But so what kind of things? I'm sure it would be helpful if someone's grieving. It seems like it would be. What kind of stuff do people want to know?
Well, to answer your question, I'd say that probably 95%, if not more, of the people that seek the services of a medium are in grief. They've had a loss. It's usually a recent loss, and a lot of them are kind of on the fence. They don't know whether they really believe in life after death or not, but they, desperately they'll try anything for the possibility of speaking to their, deceased loved one. So most people that go to mediums, but by definition are bereaved, and the information that they're looking for is evidence or identifying, information. Sometimes it's not even information that comes through. The medium will take on the personality of their loved one. Mm-hmm. But most of the time, the kind of things that come through are sometimes names, age, how they died, their likes and dislikes, activities that their loved one was engaged in, and things that will help you, to identify them so that you'll know that they're really talking to them. However, I've seen, many times I'll witness a reading that's horrible, general stuff after general stuff, but the person in grief is so desperate that they'll just latch on to anything, and sometimes they'll hear things that the medium didn't, really say. And I get that. And that's why we try to protect, the public, mediumship, when you think about it, I mean, they're sitting with people that are in various stages of mental health, really. I mean, grief is part of mental health. And there are no regulatory bodies, there are no proficiency guidelines, there are no licensing boards, there are no ethical guidelines, there's no continuing education. So tomorrow you could open up your Joel the Medium, hang up a shingle on your house and start charging people $200 for a reading.
So you're saying it's like being a podcaster?
Yeah, right. Exactly. There's good ones and there's bad ones. So I always caution, mediums, it's before they think about becoming a medium and doing that work, professionally. It comes with a lot of pressure and a lot of responsibility, because you're sitting with people that are really just, hanging on by a thread sometimes. So, I've seen one of the things that were featured in the Netflix series that you mentioned in Surviving Death was we let them come and film one of our grief retreats. We hold 4 different grief retreats per year, and we have certified mediums and grief professionals and metaphysical practitioners and so forth. But the great thing about it is we see people that they'll come in on Friday afternoon and they can barely speak. I mean, the grief is palpable, and they're in terrible shape. And by the time the weekend is over, especially if they received a very evidential, medium reading, you see a lightness and they're laughing, and it can have long-lasting effects, and it really flips the way they think about death, and that's a wonderful thing. However, the opposite could be true. You don't know your loved one still exists. You get a lousy reading or a fraudulent one, and you walk away saying, this is just a crock, and it's all bull, and
right. Right.
It has the opposite effect. So that's why I say it comes with a lot of responsibility.
I mean, like you mentioned, it's a really hard time in anyone's life. I have fairly positive views of death, when people die, that it's not the end of life. It's not the end of existence, I'll say. Even if you just are part of the ether again, you still exist somehow. But I think the consciousness goes on, but that all goes out the window for me when there's actually someone dying in front of you. It's a big difference. So I know, I understand it. Grief is a really hard place, and it's a tough place to be communicating with someone in tough time. So, I mean, for one, it's great that any way that can be helped. And there's two sides of it, because getting a bad reading, if someone's working as a sort of fraudulent medium, that's terrible. I mean, they're just taking advantage of it. But if somebody is not, if they're sincere about it, and they are sincere that they can do that, then that seems like it would be an amazing help.
Joel, many in the Victorian era. I mean, there were. I mean, I called my book "The Medium Explosion," but there were an explosion of mediums back then. Like more than like 150 years ago. Mediumship was very popular. The difference is, there was no internet, so you couldn't find out information about anybody,
Right, right.
And now it's a real concern. I mean, we caught a medium. She was doing a reading, with COVID, and mediums stopped doing in-person readings. So everything was on Zoom or different platforms. So what just as we're doing now, she had the sitter's name, first name and last name, and she had the sitter up on one half of her screen. And on the other half of her screen, she had the person's Facebook page open.
Oh, yeah.
And so she was giving a reading,
easy.
and she was spinning back, every single personal fact that she saw on Facebook. And the sitter, that's why I try to educate people about this stuff, because the sitter, they thought this was the greatest medium that ever lived. How could she possibly know this information, And it was a total fraud. So it is a concern, and people should give when they have a reading, they should give as little information as possible. Matter of fact, during the reading, you only want to give yes or no type answers. Yes, I understand. No, I don't. But people will get so excited about, maybe this medium speaking to the loved one, say, well, I'm getting your son, you have a son that's passed. And then the sitter will say, oh, yes, and he was on the track team, and he was a scholar, and he did this, and they gave the whole life story, So you want the medium to give you information, not for you to provide. They call that feeding the medium,
Well, and that's how the magicians do it. That's exactly what the magician was talking about. That's Houdini actually went around the world, and he vowed to pay any medium or mind reader that could prove that they were real. And he caught hundreds of people literally, pulling strings under tables and doing all kinds of nasty stuff. And this was in the 19-teens, I think. But it was the same thing. So, I mean, you talk about how they've been around a long time. Yes, it's been a very popular idea for a long time, and someone looking at a Facebook page is being lazy, because now they could pay a few dollars and get information from Google, like really deep information about people. So I would be very suspicious on a Zoom call, like how much that medium is it's just too easy, unfortunately, right now.
You have to be aware, in all the many years that we've been doing this work, I never had a reading personally with one of our certified mediums. And the only reason that I say that is because I couldn't trust the information, because they all knew something about me. They knew too much. So in my mind, I would always be questioning, even though I tested them and I know that they're great mediums, it wouldn't serve any purpose for me. And my wife passed away about a year and a half ago, and one of my good friends asked me if I would like to have a reading with another medium that's not certified by the foundation, but she also appeared in that Netflix series. And as a matter of fact, I had helped this person score information from readings, because actually her name was Leslie Kane, and she wrote the book Surviving Death. So I said, you know what? Yes, I would like to have a reading with her because I know she's a good medium on one condition. The only information I'm going to give her is my name is Bob, and that, God knows how many Bobs there are in the world, so that's not to identify. And I said, in order to pay for the reading, I asked my friend to pay for it using her PayPal account, so it couldn't be traced, back to me. So those were my safeguards,
Right.
And then when I did get a wonderful evidential reading, but I knew that the medium, there was no possibility she was cheating, so I appreciated that. But I'm not suggesting everybody has to go to those extremes, but you have to be careful.
Yeah, and I love it when it's, a guest answers a question that I haven't asked yet, because that was one of my questions. If you had had a reading, and how that is for you, and
well, after my daughter passed, my wife dragged me to go see a very high-profile medium because I didn't believe in it. But listen, I was in bad shape and I was desperate, and I'd try anything. And on the drive home, during the reading, the medium brought through my daughter and gave 3 extremely remote pieces of evidence that nobody could possibly have known, besides my wife. It was just so obscure, and you couldn't look it up or anything. And I drove home that whole hour drive, and I just was trying everything to try to figure it out, like the magician would. Like, how did she do this? There has to be a way. And I couldn't come up with anything. And the things were so obscure that opened me up. I'm not saying that after that I believed in it, but at least I was open to it. So I became an open-minded skeptic, which is different than being a closed-minded skeptic, because a closed-minded skeptic will just, you could show them the evidence and they just won't acknowledge the evidence. An open-minded skeptic, just questions everything but follows the evidence and went. So, for the first, I'd say 7 or 8 years that I was doing this work, despite the fact that I was speaking about it and writing about it and all this stuff, I didn't fully buy into it, so you might call me a hypocrite, but, but it took me a good 8 years before I just relented under the weight of the evidence, because I just learned and saw too much, plus personal experiences. There are, you could learn and research and read book after book after book, but then if you have some sort of a profound personal experience, that's more convincing than anything else. I like to say that a lot of people, like if you ask for a show of hands in a large group of how many people believe in an afterlife, about 80-90% of people are going to raise their hands. But what they're really saying is that they hope there's an afterlife, because maybe their religion tells them that, or, the media or this or that.
Oh, yeah.
And it comes to they hope. And then
Right.
That hope sometimes, based upon some of the things, the research and experiences, that morphs into a belief. And usually it comes after a profound personal experience, that belief turns into a knowing. And once you reach that knowing stage, you really don't fear death anymore. Like now I have absolutely no fear of death, whereas I spent a good part of my life really in fear, like a phobia, just I couldn't imagine being extinguished forever, made
okay.
sense. It was horrible. How could I cease to exist? It was horrifying, but I think that's one of the things that comes with, this belief or this knowing, is that, if you think you're going someplace else, it's maybe someplace better, it's not as a daunting proposition.
Well, I like it's far more valuable to me somehow that the person who started your organization is what is basically a skeptic. You know what? Or that, I mean, you started on that premise, which is, I mean, skepticism is good to a degree. I guess there's skepticism and there's believing in conspiracies. That's different. But it gives more credibility, I think, that you were not instantly on board with, oh yeah, mediums exist. There's an afterlife. You know, this is real. But you were still interested in investigating it and helping prove to people that that there's that it might exist, which is pretty incredible. I'm still on the fence, but I don't know that I've ever feared death. I think when I was younger, I was just too much an idiot. And as I grew older, I did, meet some spiritual teachers who, even though they never talked about an afterlife, they made it clear that there's more to this world than what we see, far more. So that kind of helped me.
Yeah.
So I fear pain much more than death.
Yeah.
I even fear pain just before death. I don't know. Death doesn't really scare me.
I don't fear death. I fear the dying process, especially if it's, I don't want to suffer,
Right.
Nor does anybody, but one of the turning points for me when we talk about when I talk about like your mind acting independently of your physical brain, I don't know if you're familiar with the remote viewing program, but during the Cold War, our own CIA developed this remote viewing program to spy on the Russians. And essentially,
there is a hilarious movie about that called Staring at Goats. That is a comedy, but I know that's based on real world stuff.
It's real stuff. And I read a tremendous amount about remote viewing, some written, 100 years ago. So I decided to do my own experiment, and this is going back about 15 years ago. And I sent the thing out to membership that every night for 5 consecutive nights at a set hour of 9 p.m. Eastern time, I was going to draw a picture. That's all I said, and I'm a lousy artist, but even so, the possibilities, when I just say draw a picture, could be anything.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I purposely wouldn't think of what I was going to draw until like 30 seconds before 9 o'clock. So try to eliminate the possibility of people reading my mind. And I asked anybody that, even if they don't think they have any kind of intuitive ability at all, like to join in at the end of the fifth night to put their drawings in an envelope and physically, mail them to me, so to compare them with my drawings. And on the last day, on Friday, I said, just to screw with everybody, I said, I'm not going to draw a picture. I'm going to draw a geometric shape. And I drew a dot with concentric circles,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we finished the experiment, and the envelopes start coming in, good number of them, and I start opening them up, and it was really disappointing. There was really nothing there as far as I could see. I could stretch here and there, but I wasn't going to do it. And I was just about, giving up, saying this is a total failure. And the last envelope I opened up was from a woman in Bend, Oregon. And I opened it up, and I'm just staring at it. 3 of the pictures were exactly what I drew. And I was trying, even though I'm a lousy artist, I was drawing as much detail as I could. One day I drew a colonial house with, 5 windows and a chimney on the left with curling smoke and the sun shining on the right and a winding path. But she had every detail there exactly. And and those concentric circles with the dot, she nailed that exactly the way I drew it. The interesting thing was, I drew that geometric shape on Friday, but she drew it on Thursday.
Oh,
so that raised the question of who's remote viewing who,
Right.
But the reason that this was so compelling to me is that, okay, I'm sitting in New York, where I was at the time, and my brain is sitting in my skull. And this woman is sitting 3,000 miles away, and her brain is housed in her skull. So how is it possible, if material science is right, this should not be possible. How can she gain information into what, I am drawing 3,000 miles away. Something is traveling, traveling is not the exact, word, but something is going on. And that's what really got me intrigued, because it's not something I read about in a book. I controlled this, informal experiment. So I knew there was no fraud involved. So, there are a lot of things like distant healing and all sorts of disciplines that show that our minds can act independently of our physical brains. And if you believe that, then why shouldn't we survive our physical death? Because our consciousness, physical brain is gone, but that's immaterial. Our consciousness just leaves the body and goes somewhere else. So in order to lay the foundation for believing in life after death, you first have to believe that our consciousness, our minds, can act independently.
That's very interesting. And a lot of people find that out from taking hallucinogens, and where they find out there's more to their consciousness than they could ever imagine. But that my point was, it still seems like science, like I can't even conceive yet, probably someone can, of how can you prove that? What part of science is, I assume it's neurological science, but maybe not. Maybe there's a part of science that we haven't even thought of that will be able to, show real proof or evidence that that's happening. Like what kind of stuff have you read, or have you, do you see any groundbreaking things happening other than people just things like you've said, remote, incredible remote viewing experiences, other than experience, I guess.
Well, there are a lot of researchers. Dean Radin was the chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and he wrote a lot of book about consciousness, and he did a tremendous number of experiments with presentiment, predicting or sensing things, before they happened, and projecting images to somebody that's in a Faraday cage that's shielded, so it shouldn't, be possible to project an image from one person, to another. He also did meta-analyses of all the laboratories around the world that did similar experiments. And when you crunch the numbers, the odds against chance of it happening, sometimes are in the billions to one. So they did, the Pear Lab at Princeton University spent a decade doing similar work. J.B. Rhine, back in the 1920s, which is now, his work continues at the Rhine Institute, was the first one that was experimenting with ESP. And some of the experiments were quite simple. He had what he developed, like they're called Zener cards, and they're 5 different cards with 5 different geometric shapes. Mm-hmm. And he would just, randomly, shuffle them, and then you, as the person being giving the information, the experimenter you had to guess what card the experimenter was going to turn up next. So you or I would have a 20% chance, right? There were 5 cards, so we should have just by guessing, there's a 20% chance that we'll get it right. But if you start getting back, 30%, that's huge, because that's not, especially with a large pool, so he was a forerunner in a lot of that stuff. But you're right. You mentioned consciousness earlier. Nobody in the world today can tell you what consciousness is.
Right.
After all the work, nobody can tell you.
No one can tell you. And in the animal kingdom, it's the same. The animals do things, communicate in ways that we can't understand at all. They communicate over hundreds of miles sometimes, and or they communicate things that we don't. Scientists watch them for years and don't get why how they're doing certain things. Yeah. It's interesting. It's very interesting, and it's just curious, because there is so much. For years, there has been evidence, and there's been all kinds of different people who've discovered things and done experiments, and But there still seems like the majority of the world is a skeptic. You started out in that camp, and especially the scientific world. Most of doctors are worried about being ostracized if they talk openly about life after death. Some of the people who've written books about it, who have actually had NDEs and written about it, have been basically kicked out of their respective careers. But whatever that was. So it's interesting.
You're right. I mean, it's and one of the things that we try to do is just get people to share what they experience, what they've learned and experienced. And if people would share it with, family or friends or colleagues or people that they know, it would enter into the mainstream in a more significant way, and people would stop, hiding it for fear of being judged or ridiculed. Quite a while back, it was about 2 years after my daughter passed. I went to see my family doctor, who was a friend of mine. I don't remember why I went there. I had some ailment, and he saw me for the first time in 2 years, and he asked me how I was doing. Okay, he says, "What have you been doing?" I said, "You really want to know?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "I'm studying survival of consciousness." And he looked at me, and then we started talking more. And 10 minutes later, he says, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "What?" He says, "What's survival of consciousness?" And I started talking about all the stuff that we're talking about now. And to make a long story short, after about 20 minutes, he had a real serious look on his face, and he closed the door, and he said, "I have to tell you something." He said, "My father died 7 years ago." He said, "And I had a lot of patients that were sick in the hospital, and I had to call my answering service. So I called my answering service to check on them, and they said, 'Oh, doctor, your father called.' And he said, 'My father died at 9 o'clock this morning.' And they said, 'Oh, I'm so sorry, doctor. He must have said your father-in-law.' He says, 'My father-in-law has been dead for 19 years. He says, what time did the call come in?' They said, 9:15. He said, 'Read me back the message.' And the message was, 'Hi, it's me. I'm okay.'" Just like that.
Whoa.
So,
wow.
and so the reason I tell that story is because he's a medical doctor. I get that, but he held that in, for the years until, he saw me. And I guarantee you, to this day, it's been 15 years since then, he's never mentioned it to his wife or to his kids, or certainly not to a colleague, not to a friend. But he heard the crap that was coming out of my mouth. He knew I wasn't going to judge him,
Right, right.
But what a shame to have an experience like that, and just to share it with somebody. Let them, judge, whether it's real or not. But and it's a shame, because a lot of people have these experiences that defy mainstream thinking, and they're just afraid to talk about it.
Oh, I guess that's true. That is a shame. It's really unfortunate. I guess I run with a crowd will talk about anything, but it definitely there's a lot of that. A lot of people are worried about what people are going to think, if they actually talk about these things openly.
Yeah. I remember, like, years ago, we used to physically take a lot of calls from people. It was mostly my wife that answered, but she was a bit hard of hearing to begin with. And sometimes somebody would call, it'd be late at night, and she'd still pick up the phone. And I could hear her say, "Could you speak up? Why are you whispering?" And it turns out because the person was calling from the Bible Belt. And, God forbid somebody would hear talking about an afterlife, and she'd be, that was it, And so it's a real thing, and people, it's gotten better over the years now, with the media attention and everything else. But we still have a while to go.
It definitely with those, like you say, programs being so popular with different mediums from different places. I see some of these programs and I get more skeptical, but that's my own judgment issue. That has nothing to do with the personality. It is bizarre. And the other thing that has always that always kind of, you mentioned the Bible Belt, and that's what's really kind of amazing, is that America is a very religious country. It's many of our even our laws even though they're not supposed to be, are based on religion. And but people, it seems like people with strong religious beliefs are some of the ones who are have the biggest fear of death, and have the hardest time actually believing in the afterlife. Maybe that's because they have such a strict view of what it should be, and they hear about something that's not exactly that view, and it throws them. I don't know.
It's also because what they're taught, the rules. I mean, if you do this, and this, you're going to go here. But if you do this, and this, you're going to burn in hell. So why would you not be fearful?
That's true. That's a good point, because I remember, I don't remember which friend it was, but I told somebody when I first was kind of awakening to spiritual stuff that I didn't believe in the concept of hell, and that just scared the crap out of them. That just really scared them. They couldn't understand that, and I was like, oh, okay. I don't know how to deal with that.
Yeah, I know. It's there are people, we don't encounter it as much, but used to be an issue that people would chastise us for the work that we're doing, even the science, because it flies in the against a lot of religions. It's okay for the people within the religion, the higher ups, to practice some of these things, but you're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to communicate with God and so forth. But the fact is that the founders of today's modern day religions all came out of these ages of mysticism, when all this stuff was part of everyday life. People commune with their ancestors. People communicated, telepathically. And after the dogma started coming in, I mean, all religions were the same. They were based on compassion and love without rules. But once the rules started coming in, that's where I think we lost it a bit,
Yeah, and I know it's an unpopular belief in religious circles, but all those rules were made up to control people.
Right.
And when you need something. It's interesting because I read the book Sapiens, which is about the history of mankind, basically, and how important it is for people to have rules at a certain point. When there's so many of us, if you don't have something to believe in, it's really tough. I mean, it's kind of amazing now because I think there's very few people who believe in religion strictly, like strict religion and strict, but all of us have morals. All of us follow rules to the point that our society doesn't break down. This always amazes me. I mean, we don't, our society doesn't break down into a madhouse like all the apocalyptic movies, because we're really just being polite, right? We're not, It's not like we're afraid of something. You're not usually, there's not that much, the rules aren't that well enforced, but we all kind of follow them anyway, basic stuff.
The thing that struck me, early on in this work is that if you talk to people that have near-death experiences in some of these channeled reports in history, like near-death experiences will tell you that they have a life review, many of them. And that life review is like a movie reel that just flashes, before your eyes. And you see basically your whole life unfold before you. But as it's unfolding, you get to feel all of the good and the love and the help that you provided to others, but you also feel tangibly, the pain and the hardship that you cause to others as well. And that can't be a comfortable thing. And the consensus is that we are, it's all self-judgment, that like after we pass on to this next world, it's not a tribunal that says you go here or you go there. We go where we think we belong based upon our own judgment, and to me, that always made a lot more sense, so,
right.
But that still gives you the incentive to lead a compassionate and empathic life, so, and to help people, because hell, who wants to feel bad,
Exactly. the better you treat people, the better you're going to feel anyway. And I mean, that's just common sense.
Right.
One of the most interesting theories that I heard was from Deepak Chopra, I think it was, where he wrote, it was just a quote I saw on some social media or something, but he was talking about how all these NDEs and that people have are showing them like the beginning of what's going to happen. And that made a lot of sense to me. Like you're seeing this because you're not really staying there. And if you do stay there, it's going to go beyond what we can possibly explain. That part I really do believe that the spirit world, the afterlife, the what's it called? Well, some people call it God, but the grand consciousness is not really explainable to us. We're experiencing a very linear existence in our earthly vessels, I guess you'll say. And that, so that always made a lot of sense to me. And it also explains why people see things so differently. You know, you have, like you said, there's like 10 common ideas that people seem to express. And some people see it in a very sort of more religious way, it seems like. Other people from different places of the world, I've understand, see it differently. Like they have different experiences. So it definitely is based on what you've learned here. And then it maybe that's just, whatever's after that is you can't possibly explain it.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I mean, because we have to test with the problem of putting their experience into words. That's why they call it ineffable. So they don't have a hard time doing that. But you can only put it into language based upon your own frame of reference, so and so like you mentioned, somebody in one part of the world might talk about seeing Buddha on the other side, and somebody else might talk about seeing Jesus, somebody else. It's all based upon your own frame of reference. The interesting thing about near-death experiences is that almost all the time when people do come back, and after they're resuscitated, they tell us that they were told that it's not their time, and
right. That is pretty common, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. So what about all the people that don't get resuscitated? I guess it was their time.
Get told it's your time, like in the last episode of This Is Us.
Right.
But yeah, I guess that's true. That's a very interesting point. They do usually get told that. Very interesting. It's just when I read or hear people talk about near-death experiences, it's almost, I don't think I've ever seen one that was negative. I mean, there've been there's been hard things that happen, but never really a negative experience. It all sounds, and the same with readings, mediumship readings that are, that we assume are legit. It's not many negative ones that come out of that.
Yeah, I mean, there are a certain percentage of NDEs that are negative. It's a small, probably 10% to possibly 15%. But again, that could be attributed to one's beliefs. I mean, if you thought that you were going to burn in hell for something, and that might cause you might start to panic, and it might be a negative thing. Your other point, though, is true, and which is quite amazing to me. So in the past 20 years, I never witnessed a negative medium reading. It's only positive, loving information. And I believe that we do have, both positive and negative forces in the world, and this world and the next world. So it always was curious when I asked the mediums, I mean, how come you never bring through anything that's dark or negative? Their answer was always that I asked the universe or my guides or whatever to surround me with white light and not allow any of that information to come through. Probably a responsible medium, if they received a a dire thing would not convey that to the sitter anyways. But it is curious to me that never does negative information get through, for whatever reason.
That's real. That is interesting. So you never hear them say, "Oh, Uncle Bob's with me," and he never liked you. You never. You don't get that.
Joel, I take that back. Once, it was about 18 years ago. I was at this retreat that some medium was holding in England. And there was a medium that got up there and he did just what you were talking about. He's bringing through this woman's uncle and he goes, "Oh, I have your uncle here." And he goes, "Wow, what a son of a bitch." I was like appalled. I thought it was like a shtick, it was like he's doing a stand-up, but he was bringing through negative thing after that. But that was the only time I ever saw that.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah. Well, good. I'm glad it doesn't happen a lot.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, this has been a great conversation. I think I should let you get back to your work because it's really good work. I appreciate. Oh, we didn't even hardly talk about your book. We mentioned it briefly.
Yeah. Well, the book is called The Medium Explosion. People can find it on Amazon. Mm-hmm. The website you could find out about all the stuff we're talking about is foreverfamilyfoundation.org. You also write a blog called beyondthefivesenses.com. So you can always get in touch with me in any of these ways.
That's great. And all of that stuff will be in the links, in the description, of course.
Okay.
Of course, 100%. So, yeah, I guess we should wrap it up. And I'll just say this has been, Were You Still Talking? I am Joel Albrecht, and I've been talking to Bob Ginsberg, founder of Forever Family Foundation. It's been an amazing conversation. Really appreciate having you on the show. Learn a lot, and I really appreciate the work you're doing. Like I say, it's I like seeing someone who's out there trying to investigate and validate this type of science. Some people call it pseudoscience. I would call it science. It's something that I think is just not discovered yet. That's where it seems to me. So discovering new grounds, opening new territory. It's really been fantastic having you on. Thanks a lot.
Thanks. I really enjoyed it, Joel. Thanks.
All right. And as I always say, be good to each other and be good to yourself. All right. Fantastic.